Imagine being born and never once feeling the warmth of another person's skin. Not a kiss on the forehead, not a hand to hold, not a single hug, not even from your mother. No playgrounds, no sleepovers, no scraped knees or great adventures, and instead living a life of filtered air, plastic walls and gloved hands. A childhood spent staring at the world through clear barriers, knowing that everything is real, but never quite being able to touch it. Some would call this a miracle of science, others may call it something else entirely, because there's a huge difference between keeping someone alive and being able to let them truly live. But for one boy, this was never really a choice. Born into confinement, raised inside invention, but not doing this by neglect or cruelty, but instead by love, desperation, and the hope that maybe one day they'd help him find a way out. By the way, this is Dark Case, and you can call me Jack. I bring you rare and unseen true crime cases, as well as other things that you may later regret knowing, with multiple uploads every single week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, then make sure you join the Dark Case family now by hitting subscribe and turning all notifications on. And now for today's silly little question. If you could go back and give 10-year-old you some advice, what would it be? Let me know down in the comments. All of your support over on Patreon, as well as right here via channel memberships on YouTube, are so appreciated, so thank you so much. And now, on with the video. In those first years, David Vetter lived entirely within Texas Children's Hospital. His bubble was connected to heavy-duty air compressors that had to constantly run to keep it inflated. It was pressurized and germ-free. However, the noise these compressors made was deafening. People had to shout to be heard over the mechanical hum, a real form of torture on its own. His caregivers wore gowns, masks, and gloves. There was no skin-to-skin contact. Every single thing that he touched had to be sterilized. Water, diapers, clothing, even the air that he breathed. His own mother was not allowed to hold him. His father could not cradle him to sleep. To most of the world, this was truly unthinkable. But to David, it was just normal. As he grew older, doctors began preparing him for the truth. They used storybooks and drawings to help explain what germs actually were, how the world outside his plastic dome could be dangerous to him, and why, for now, he had to stay exactly where he was. By age 4, David had figured out how to poke holes in his own bubble, using a medical needle that someone had left behind. When questioned about this, he admitted that he simply wanted to see what would happen, and it was then, for the first time, he could truly realize how fragile his world was. NASA engineers developed a second isolated chamber, specifically so it could be installed in the Vetter household in Conroe, Texas. This allowed David to spend time outside the hospital for 2 to 3 weeks at a time without ever being exposed to germs. A transport bubble, essentially a mobile containment pod, was also built so that he could travel. In every possible way, his parents brought the outside world in. A television was wired into his chamber. A phone connected to a speaker became his classroom. He had teachers, doctors. In fact, he had a lot of normal elements, but just a very different life. Despite the layers of plastic and protocol, David's parents insisted on one thing above all else. His life would not just become one big science experiment. He would be raised as a son, a brother, and allowed to be a child. David was even baptized with sterilized holy water by one of his doctors, who luckily also happened to be a lay Catholic. He celebrated holidays from within his bubble. Trick-or-treaters visited the house, and David would pass candy out to them, using the rubber-gloved portals. His sister Catherine stayed close. Whenever he was home, inside his containment chamber, she slept right next to the bubble. David even had a pet duck. He loved spaghetti, and he memorized every detail of Star Wars. When he misbehaved, his mother scolded him like any other kid. Once, after seeing his own picture in a newspaper, he proudly declared, "I'm a star now." The mother smiled and reminded him that stars still had to clean up their toys. The more that David learned, the more that he wondered. Why couldn't he go outside like his sister Catherine? Why did people stare? Why was he so different? By age 7, he was asking real questions, and sometimes darker ones. He once spoke to his psychologist and said, "Why school? Why make me learn to read? What good will it do? I won't ever be able to do anything anyway, so why?" It was the first time that he gave voice to a quiet truth. He wasn't just waiting for a cure. He was waiting to be able to live the life that he saw everyone else enjoying. From the outside, David's world looked like something out of science fiction, but from the inside, it was just home. The bubble was custom built to grow with him. It started as a crib-sized isolator, but eventually it expanded into a living space that included a playroom, a learning station, and a viewing window where David could watch his sister and friends playing together outside. Every single item that he came into contact with, books, toys, even pencils, had to be sterilized for hours before reaching him. Some had to be aerated for days. Even the erasers on his pencils were a real problem. That is, before NASA engineers figured out how to properly sterilize them. And before that, David would get upset when he made a mark that he couldn't remove. In sheer frustration, sometimes he'd become emotional. Something that his mother called a very normal child reaction, and I'd agree. He did have friends, real ones. A neighborhood boy named Sean became his best friend. He would visit the home often, and the two of them would watch TV together. They'd read comic books, and even make prank calls from inside the isolator. David could sass back at his parents, he could argue with his sister, and he would lose interest in school like any other kid. Sometimes he'd accidentally lose his pencil to avoid class, until his mother, of course, found it again. But certain things couldn't be faked. When summer came and kids played outside, David would press his face to the bubble and watch. Sometimes he'd ask why he couldn't join in, and other times he'd go quiet and not ask at all. When his sister left to get hamburgers with a friend's family, David jumped up and yelled, "I want to go too." But then within seconds, he stepped back and softly said, "No, I don't." And that was the line that he walked every single day. One foot in childhood, the other in a plastic prison. And behind his bright personality, his expressive eyes had begun to change. He was becoming more thoughtful, more private, more aware that the rest of the world was still just out of reach. By age 6, David had spent every day of his life inside plastic. But then came the suit. NASA engineers stepped up once again, and used to designing protective gear for astronauts, they created something extraordinary. A pressurized mobile life support system, a custom-built biological isolation suit that could allow David to walk outside without danger. It had 24 steps just to connect it to the bubble, and another 28 to get him into it. The first time, David hesitated. He was rightly terrified. But on July the 29th, 1977, he did it. He crawled through a sanitized tunnel. He climbed inside, the chamber sealed. And then, for the very first time in his life, he took steps outside of his bubble. His mother, Carol Ann, burst into tears. She was finally able to hold her son, not through rubber gloves nor through plastic, but to actually hold him in her arms. She would later say, "I held his spirit for years, but never his body." He only used that suit 6 times. It was bulky, awkward, and he outgrew it fast. But for a few fleeting moments, David had touched the world, and it could touch him back. By 1983, David was 12 years old. He'd grown taller, quieter, more reflective. He'd started talking about the stars. On his birthday, his family rolled the transport isolator outside and let him stargaze for 20 minutes. Through that transparent chamber, he looked up at a sky that was somehow even further away for him than it is for us. And shortly after came the news. Dr. William Shearer, David's longtime physician, had learned of a new technique, bone marrow transplants no longer required a perfect match. It was experimental and risky, but it offered David something that he had never truly had before, a plan to get out of the bubble. His sister Catherine, now a teenager, agreed to be the donor. She flew to Boston for the procedure. Her marrow was extracted, treated, and then flown back to Houston. On October the 21st, David helped inject it into his own bloodstream. He was excited and hopeful. He gave his sister a sapphire and diamond ring as a thank you gift, and then everyone waited. If this worked, then David could slowly begin to build an immune system, but if it didn't, he'd be left even more vulnerable than before. And for weeks, everything seemed stable. He was even able to go home for Christmas. But by New Year's Eve, something was wrong. David developed a fever, and then he got sick. Severe abdominal pain followed. He was rushed back to the hospital, but now there was a new problem. The bubble that had always kept him safe was now also keeping doctors out. On February the 7th, David made the decision himself. He would leave the isolator. With quiet courage, he stepped inside a sterile hospital room. He was free of plastic walls for the first time in his life, and then for 15 days he battled the illness. His mother sat beside him and gently ran her fingers through his hair, something she had never been able to do before. But David was deteriorating fast. On February the 22nd, 1984, he entered a coma. That night, with his family by his side, David Vetter's time on this earth drew to a close. This was just months before becoming a teenager. An autopsy revealed the cause. It was lymphoma. The transplanted marrow had carried a hidden passenger, a dormant Epstein-Barr virus that had reactivated inside of David's defenseless system, and that triggered the cancer. The transplant that was meant to save him had instead been the catalyst for the end. Letters flooded in from around the world, condolences, donations, and questions. Was it worth it? Did he suffer? Was it ethical to keep a child alive in this way? There were no easy or definitive answers, but there was one undeniable outcome. David's blood and tissue samples were preserved by doctors, and 9 years later in 1993, scientists used those samples, along with 2 others, to discover the gene responsible for SCID. This was a real breakthrough. Soon after, prenatal screenings became possible, and then gene therapy, and that was followed by safer bone marrow transplants. Today, nearly every child born with SCID has a chance at a normal life. Most of them never need a bubble at all. Most never even remember being sick when they grow up. And that is in a big part because of David. He never touched the world, but the world was touched by him. And now, David Elementary School stands today in Woodlands, Texas. His sister Catherine has 2 children of her own, and the David Center at Texas Children's Hospital continues to treat and study immune disorders using what he gave them. And I'm not just talking about the samples or the data drawn from what he went through. He also gave them his time on this earth. He gave them his patience. He gave them 12 years of waiting and hoping. And while his body may now be gone, his legacy truly lives on in every child that can grow up free, thanks to the boy who never was. Be careful out there, and I'll see you soon.